everyone, and welcome to our third annual Autism Hope Summit. We've just been so excited to bring these summits to you, and I know many of you guys can't attend live, conferences, and this is a great way for you to learn from some of the top experts in the world. Well, today we have an amazing speaker. His name is Dr. Benjamin, and we are going to be talking about insulin resistance, which is a huge epidemic today, and we're going to figure out how we can tie that into how that's in your life with autism or maybe in your own life. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Benjamin.
Thanks. I'm thrilled.
And so I know I want to make sure I say your last name right. So that's why I first just Is it Bikman? Is that correct?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Sometimes I look at the names, I'm like, I'm just going to go with the first name.
Yeah.
I don't want to butcher that. So, but before we get started, let's talk about where your background is and why you are so passionate about talking about your subject now.
Right. So it's not every person who has any concern for insulin or insulin resistance, like you said. My graduate studies initially had me focusing on obesity. And as I kept looking into and studying and learning more about obesity, the more I began to appreciate that we always talked about how too much body fat is causing some sort of disease. And yet there was that big middle section where what was connecting this body fat to the disease. And the deeper and deeper I got into this, the more and more I realized that it was because of this condition called insulin resistance, where this hormone insulin is steadily going up and up and up in the person's body, and yet the body is, in some parts of the body, losing the responsiveness to it. And overall, that's pretty much what's connecting metabolic problems like too much body fat to virtually every disease you can imagine, what I often call the plagues of prosperity. All of these chronic diseases that we're dying from these days, at their core, they're either caused by or made worse by insulin resistance. So that's my focus now as a scientist and a professor. I study what is the relevance of insulin in disease and what we can do about it.
And so that, when you're talking about insulin resistance, I don't remember being a kid hearing this a lot.
No.
Now it feels as though it's all over. It's just very common. Why is that? And how is this happening?
Yeah, so it has become remarkably common. You used the word epidemic, and that's aptly used, where it is the single most common health disorder worldwide. And so we're talking about the single most common disorder. It's half of all adults in the US, half of all adults in China, in India, which are, of course, massive countries with population. And it's over half of all adults in some countries like Mexico or the Pacific Islands or virtually any of the countries in the Middle East. Over half of all adults have this condition. And the reason we don't know about it is because you can't see it. You don't, other than the person maybe being a little heavy, although they don't always look heavier than normal, but it's not an obvious disease. And usually we only detect the symptoms. So the person will be diagnosed as having a high blood pressure. And we think, oh, well, you just have hypertension and that's the disease. And yet very, very often the cause of that person's hypertension will be insulin resistance. Or we diagnose a woman with polycystic ovarian syndrome and we think, oh, you just have a problem with your hormones or your ovaries. And yet at its core, that's overwhelmingly a problem of too much insulin, which is what we have with insulin resistance. And that's what's causing the other hormones to be disrupted, and that's causing the PCOS. So nevertheless, this has become the most common epidemic, and it is absolutely, unavoidably a result of the foods that we eat today.
Absolutely. And you talked a little bit about symptoms. What are, other than high blood pressure, what other symptoms are there? And what something that, for example, a family that has a child with autism, sometimes, when I think of this in the past, I would think, oh, maybe something with diabetes or or high blood, but we're looking at things and the tests aren't coming back and really telling us a lot, and yet we're seeing symptoms still. So what are some symptoms that a parent could maybe start looking at and maybe potentially figure some other things out we're going to be talking about?
Right. Yeah. What a great question. So it's the obvious symptoms are not what we're talking about in a case like autism, which is such a difficult disorder to really kind of put a finger on what's wrong. But even still, there could be some relevance with this overall environment that we live in that's particularly problematic and causing insulin resistance. We know that the brain is very susceptible to problems with glucose, the blood sugar glucose, which is of course very much related to insulin. Typically, as blood glucose starts to climb, depending on the foods we're eating, insulin has to come up to push the glucose out of the blood and into the body tissues. And then insulin will come back down as glucose comes back down. Well, the brain is a main consumer of glucose, although it doesn't have to only use glucose. But nevertheless, the brain can become very sick as the body becomes insulin resistant. And an obvious example of that is something like Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common type of brain disorder. And I know that's, of course, very different from autism, but I believe it can be relevant, as I'll get to in a moment. But with Alzheimer's disease, it is so linked to insulin levels that someone's insulin levels are more predictive of their Alzheimer's risk than their age. And so it just represents just how potent this is, how the brain can be so altered as glucose isn't being used very well or insulin levels are too high. With regards to autism, what is in fact so relevant and timely about this is just this very morning, there was a paper published, a case report that looked at a 6-year-old autistic boy, and they looked at the degree to which his brain could use glucose. And they found that the glucose use in the brain was compromised. It wasn't able to use glucose as well as it should have been able to. And that could have been what was explaining his, as they noted in this paper, this research paper, his high degree of functioning autism and his learning disabilities and his inability to pay attention. And so what they did is they shifted his diet in a way that started to control. And this is very much relevant to a takeaway message. And it's one thing I would hope for parents to take away and something we can emphasize again at the end. But they shifted the diet in this little boy to control his sugar and refined starch consumption, and which are, of course, foods that increase insulin significantly, and rather focused more on the other macronutrients, fat and protein, which don't have much of an insulin effect, if any. And they found that within just 1 month, there were absolute quantifiable changes in his attention and in his behavior and in his learning. And they all got better within just 1 month. And they followed this boy in this case report for 16 months. And they found this ongoing improvement and sustained improvement throughout this entire period. I mean, I can just imagine, first of all, I can't imagine what it's like to be a parent and the patience you'd have to have in this situation. And my heart just goes out to these parents. But I can imagine the hope that these parents had at the time after these failures with regards to other therapies and other interventions they were trying with the boy. And it mentions this in this published paper. And yet realizing that all they needed to do was change something as simple as the diet. Now, dietary changes aren't easy, as anybody knows who's tried to make a change in the way they eat. It's not easy to do, but it is a simple idea. And sure enough, within 1 month, as I said, by controlling the amount of glucose this boy was eating, and because insulin was coming down, it introduced a new type of fuel that I almost, I don't want to make this too complicated, but by controlling insulin and controlling glucose, the brain ends up using another fuel called ketones. And as these ketones were fueling the brain more, theoretically, there had to be something to explain the shift. And it could be that. But nevertheless, as the boy was controlling his sugars and starches, brain function improved. And again, this was just published within the last 24 hours.
Now, when you're talking about foods that are feeding, really increasing the insulin, what are the top foods? I'm thinking obviously of, in our community, we really promote gluten-free, dairy-free, but that doesn't mean that there's not carbs and sugars.
Oh, absolutely not. No, I know. No, now that is relevant though. That I love that you brought that up. So in someone who's wanting to make a dietary change, depending on health, now that would depend on the situation, but there are situations where you look at the most common proteins that someone can have a negative reaction to. And overwhelmingly, that's a protein in gluten, grains and wheat in particular, and a protein in dairy to casein, a sensitivity to casein. And those are common things that if someone has a food sensitivity, it's going to be those sorts of things. So it doesn't make sense to address those. But as you mentioned with gluten-free, one of the problems is, sure, someone may be avoiding the gluten, but as a diabetes, obesity scientist who focuses on glucose and insulin, unfortunately, as they've taken out the wheat, they've put in tapioca starch, they've put in potato starch, and those things increase your blood glucose and insulin levels even more than the wheat did. Now, they won't have the gluten in it, and so the person would just need to decide, well, has this been an improvement or not? But nevertheless, to really get to your question, what is increasing insulin and glucose? Or I should say, what is increasing insulin? The question is then more fundamentally, as you suggested, what is increasing my glucose the most? Because whatever's doing that is going to increase insulin the most. And it is the refined starches, and this would be even something like bread, bagels, cereal, and then sugar, of course, treats, which is unfortunate. You know, my favorite indulgence is a cinnamon roll. And the more I learn and the older I get, the less I allow myself to indulge, because it's just not worth it. You know, that temporary pleasure of eating the cinnamon roll. I think, well, as my insulin's going up, that's going to be affecting my brain. That's going to be affecting my body fat and my joint health and my heart health and any number of things that we don't want to take the time to dive into now. And so I just forego and go back to my, whatever other food I may have available.
Well, I know as you're talking, because my son has autism, and we're constantly looking at different diets and trying to figure out things. We know that there are some studies or surveys, I'm not sure how to call it these days, but put it this way, we know there's a lot of children on the spectrum when they hit puberty. I've heard reports as high as 40% that are becoming epileptic. My son got that membership card too when we hit puberty. And
interesting.
So it's really fascinating. And here's one thing, we hear about the keto diet, but when you have a growing child, and I'm so fascinated to talk to you about this, but when you have a growing child, it's super hard to figure out how to keep them full, because I'm a huge believer in, good fats and protein and vegetables. For him, fruits are a little much because he has also yeast issues. So we try to stick away from that. Then what becomes left, right? Because then trying to fill that child up, yes, good fats definitely fill, but they also burn pretty fast. And you have this kid, and a boy of all things, that are, we all remember being young and being hungry.
Oh, yeah.
And so, we turned to potatoes and we turned to rice. Rice didn't do so well, but now we're noticing an issue with potatoes. So my thought is, oh my goodness gracious, what is left? Because we don't do corn, we don't do gluten with any type of stuff. We don't do any form of dairy. We don't do soy. We don't do refined sugars in any way. So, after a while, you're like, okay, well, this is great.
Yeah.
I know families are out there in the same boat as I am, right?
Oh, I can't imagine, honestly. My heart goes out to you. I can't imagine how almost helpless you'd feel. But nevertheless, I mean, if there is some sort of let's not focus on the helplessness. I mean, what
That's
sort of...
Yeah, because here's the thing, and I joke about this in my lectures. I say, guys, you're so worried about this gluten-free, dairy-free thing, and that's the foundation of everything. I'm like, raise your hand if you've been in the meat department and produce department. And then, of course, you don't get a lot of participation sometimes in lectures, and they don't raise their hands. And I say, wow,
sure.
Then we've got a bigger problem. And they all start laughing. And I say, so raise your hand. Everyone raises their hand. I say, well, congratulations. You're in, for the most part, the gluten-free and dairy-free, section.
Well, I mean, really, I mean, if a diet, and this is, to say this, I need to make this clear. To say this is a little controversial in some circles, as the world is wanting to steer further and further away from meat and animal products. This is becoming more and more of a sensitive topic. The great tragedy of that is, though, as a scientist, I don't buy it. This idea that you have to avoid animal fat's going to kill you. As a species, we've been eating that since the very beginning of time, and it hasn't been killing us until I would say, started eating these seed oils. But that's almost a different topic, and I don't want to have to go into that. I don't want to go into it unless you want us to go that way. But I will say, with regards to foods, you already mentioned meat and vegetables, slam dunk. But as you said, there's only so much you can do. There's only so many ways you can prepare meat. And so all I would add to that is the magic of the egg. And I don't mean to sound silly, but I believe, I truly do. It is my thought that that is the most perfectly single food packaged with every micronutrient, because it is everything to sustain life. I mean, that is the potential for life in that egg. And as we eat that egg, we can rest assured that we're getting not only these two good macronutrients, fats and proteins, and then virtually every micronutrient you could possibly really care about. And the nice thing about eggs is they are remarkably versatile. I've made in the past custards from the egg yolks using not sugar, but a different sort of sweetener that won't increase my glucose and insulin. And that was pretty much the whole thing. It was some egg yolks, a little bit of, well, I used cream, although I'm sure there'd be some substitute, but it wasn't a lot. But nevertheless, you can make desserts with eggs. You can make these savory little muffins. You can cook them any number of ways. I've been delighted as I've tried to steer my kids away from eating out of bags and boxes with barcodes. I mean, that's pretty much the wrong way to eat, but it's pretty much the way our culture eats, which is why we have this epidemic of insulin resistance and all the plagues of prosperity. It's because we're eating out of boxes and bags with barcodes on them. But one of the things I've been able to do is shift them by using eggs in some pretty clever ways, like even making treats. Like I said, it's really remarkable what you can do. And eggs, I'll use eggs and almond flour as a base for, and then other little things here and there as a base, if you will, for making waffles and pancakes and crepes. But eggs are the theme. For my little family of 5, I would say we probably go through 4 dozen eggs a week, or certainly 2 to 3 dozen eggs a week.
Well, and I think for us as well, and I know a lot of people out there have egg allergies, but if you don't, it's a bummer, right?
Yeah.
But,
I don't know. I guess there's only so much you can do.
Yeah, but I mean, for us, it's a huge protein source, and we use eggs all the time in our home. When I do talk about meat, I do want to really emphasize that I'm at least for me, I can say we buy organic, meats, no hormones. We're very careful on that. I know it's a little bit more pricey, but I'm a big believer of what you put in your body, really has a direct effect. And our kiddos are so already overly toxic. We know that. And so we don't want to add more to this bucket if we don't have to. And I want to go back to, insulin because I'm very fascinated, especially if I'm imagining myself in the grocery store right now, and I'm thinking, I want to buy low foods that aren't going to raise this. I want to. How do we make sure we can? You talked about fat. You talked about proteins. What are some of are there versions of a lower kind of quote carb? Like I'm thinking, is a sweet potato something that would be better than a white potato? Obviously corn for us, we don't want to touch that. Others might, that's just my personal thing. But let's say I'm taking my grocery cart and I'm trying to figure out eggs. What's some other foods that we can get? We know vegetables. What are your top ones that you feel like are really helpful?
Yeah. What a great question. So there are some general rules when it comes to foods and insulin control. Now, when it comes to proteins and fats, anything goes. You don't have to scrutinize that. And now when I say fats, it is common, as you've mentioned, to say healthy fats. And even that is sort of a gray area. To me, a healthy fat is looking at the fat and saying, is this a fat that my great grandparents would have eaten? In other words, is it
like our
So in other words, would our species have been eating that fat throughout the millennia? And when it comes to those fats, by my definition, if that's the ruler, it is animal fats and fruit fats. And fruit, as you mentioned, that's coconuts, avocados, olives. Those are fats that early man, however we came to be who we are today, all early man would have had to do is create a lever or just squish the coconut, squish the olives or squish the avocados, and they would have had oil. When it comes to the modern oils that have saturated our food supply, like soybean oil or canola oil, these are oils that require a remarkable degree of manufacturing. They require chemicals, temperature, pressure, machinery that have only existed within the last couple generations. And so those are the new oils. And I would say those are the oils to be wary of, or at least to make it diplomatic, I'll say those are the oils I'm wary of. So nevertheless, I've gotten a little off topic. So fats and proteins, those are generally just going to be fine. When it comes to the starches, as you said, that's when there's some degree of scrutiny. And I justify that because we've changed plants. These are not the same plants they used to be. If you compare apples, the apples that we have nowadays to the apples that were available 100 years ago, they were almost exclusively little crab apples, these small little bitter things that had much less fructose in it. Nevertheless, with fruits, I generally, as a middle-aged man who's trying to control my insulin, and then this, of course, could apply, I use this with my children as well. I have different tiers, where the top tier of fruit for me that I encourage my children to indulge in, it's berries. Mm-hmm. Any type of berry has a very small effect on insulin for the most part. So raspberries, strawberries, blackberries, etc. And that's fine because they're also very convenient little foods. And so I can just wash them and leave them in a little bowl, and my kids can just come and pick at those things as they want to. The next level of fruits are citrus fruits that are also good. I mean, we're talking, we're going along this kind of gradient of good. And then next, it would be something depending on the type of apple, and things like that. And then in general, the fruits that I avoid because of their effect on blood glucose and insulin are the tropical fruits, like mangoes, pineapples. Those are very sugary. Even though they're natural sugars, they're still going to affect glucose and insulin. So I try to avoid them. And then with vegetables, I use a very basic rule with regards to trying to keep insulin in control. And that's if it grows above the ground, it's okay. That's a generalization, but it still tends to hold water. It's pretty valid with regards to it being a vegetable that will have a minimal effect on insulin and glucose, or not a minimal effect.
Oh, that's great. And then let us talk about a little bit about the protein, the animal products. We touched base, briefly on it. Are there particular animal products that I guess spike or increase or decrease? Or I know you said earlier they're pretty much all good, but
Oh yeah, there are. Yeah, so any of them are going to be a lot lower than starches, carbohydrates. But still, it does have within its own category of protein. There are some proteins that have a higher or lower effect. And in fact, it becomes almost one layer more complicated. It sort of depends on the amino acids that the protein is made up of, because it's those amino acids that are then going to elicit an insulin effect or not. And so things like white meat can have a higher insulin effect than, say, a red meat can, because of the different types of amino acids. But I almost hate to say that, because while that's true, I wouldn't want someone to necessarily avoid white meat because of that, like chicken and turkey. I think they're fine. But dairy, milk especially, milk does have a very robust insulin effect, and that's because it has a lot of that dairy sugar in it, lactose, which is converted into glucose. Right when it gets into the body, it gets converted to glucose, and so insulin has to try to fight that. And so for me, as a grown-up, I don't really drink milk, or it's very, very uncommon, because I consider milk, and this is a kind of non-scientific statement, so you'll pardon me for saying it, but milk is a food for growth, where when you look at in mammals, why we're unique in the animal kingdom is that the mother gives milk to the baby. I mean, that's what sort of sets mammals apart. And that is because it helps the baby grow, and it helps baby grow really well. I'm done growing. I don't need to grow anymore. My bones are done growing. The only kind of growth I'm going to have is going to be growing out, and I don't want to do that. So yeah, so milk is something I don't eat much of. However, what's so relevant about our day and age, though, is that once upon a time, almost everything we would have eaten, whether it was carbohydrate or dairy, it would have been to some degree fermented. we didn't have refrigerators. We didn't have chemicals to preserve these things. And so even milk, once upon a time, would more often, or just as often as not, probably been more of a sour milk, where bacteria would have, what do bacteria eat? They eat glucose. That's what they eat, whether it's in the body or whether it's in the bottle or whatever. Bacteria eat glucose. And so the glucose, the bacteria is in the milk, and it's eating through this milk sugar, the lactose. And so as you're drinking this more kind of sour milk, or what we would call like a kefir or kefir, however someone wants to say it, that's where bacteria have eaten through the milk sugar. And so you're left with relatively less sugar. You have all the same protein and fat because they don't touch those things. And then you just have this little bit of acid that the bacteria have produced, and that's what gives it that sour taste. And you're getting the bacteria, which is good with this probiotics. And the same thing used to apply to grains. We don't eat bread the same way we used to. We used to have it, it was almost always, it would have been a sourdough bread because it would have fermented and fermented over a long period of time. But now we use baking soda or quick acting yeast. They didn't have those things once upon a time. So nevertheless, when it comes to dairy, if it has been a fermented dairy, I'm much more willing to consume it because I'm getting less glucose and less insulin. So something like kefir or even yogurt or even cottage cheese, those have much less sugar in it than just milk does. And so I look at them, I give them more of a green light.
Well, and, for us, because my son and many of those listening and watching, we don't do gluten, we don't do dairy. And,
right.
But, young coconut kefir, you can make that with, the white coconuts. And that's, you can make a kefir, out of that.
Yeah.
Fermented vegetable, you can make what we call cultured vegetables if you know
Mm-hmm.
the ecology diet. So there's definitely lots of options out there. For us, we switched over to either almond milk or coconut milk.
Good for you. Not soy milk.
No, we don't do anything with soy. There are doctors out there that believe that soy is recognized in the body as dairy, and so for us, we never touch it.
Yeah, and it has off-target effects. I mean, especially with a little boy, if you've got a boy, then soy is enriched with molecules that can mimic estrogens, and that's a conflicted area of science, but there are studies to show that those estrogens from the soy can influence the body. So yeah, good. I do not recommend soy in any case, but there are other good options like you said, coconut and almond. Those are very viable. We use we use almond milk often actually because it has almost no sugar or none. It's just protein and fat. So it's a great mix.
Well, my other question for you is, what about rice? What does rice feed? Good, bad, in between? It's interesting.
Yeah.
The reason I say this is because for some reason, at least my son cannot tolerate rice for whatever reason that is. And yet I look at other countries and they live on rice. Like and it seems as though they're healthy. And I can't figure out for the life of me of why. Maybe I'm making it wrong, or is there different types of rice?
Yeah. Oh, there are many different types of rice.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. There are many different types.
I've tried I think it's called oh goodness, I can't remember. It's like a yellow kind of California blend rice. I've tried the brown rice. I've tried the white. I mean, there's, they have all these different types. I've tried so many, and yet nothing seems to work. And I want to ask about rice, and I want to ask about quinoa, because to me those two seem to be either a hit or miss with people. And I wanted to know your take when you're looking at your insulin levels. What are those two particular food groups?
Yeah. So mentioning rice. So as you said, this topic, I'll let me preface this by saying this is involving a little bit of speculation on my part because I'm not a rice expert. And there are so many different types. I'm an insulin diabetes guy by trade and obesity. Nevertheless, rice is a curiosity because you have a culture like in, say, Okinawa, Japan, where they're eating rice very, very often. And these are some of the longest lived people.
They don't have diabetes in the same way, right?
Very much less than we do. But of course, it's climbing though, mind you. It's climbing just like it is here and everywhere else. They're on the same trend as everyone else. They're just further back. And so, how can we explain that? That almost leaves insulin behind and gets into the fact that they tend to eat less of the seed oils. In fact, the longest lived people in Okinawa are the people who eat the most pork, which is sort of Yeah, that was published. That's a paper published, and so I'm not making that up. And so they found that among the Okinawans, the longest lived were the ones that were eating the most animal products. So maybe they're
Wow.
eating, maybe thus they're eating a lesser amount of rice. But I don't know that. Um,
Yeah.
so when it comes to different rice eating cultures, I'm not quite sure how to reconcile that. And I would say that in that instance, it's probably something independent of the glucose and insulin effect, and more of these other variables, like how much sugar are they eating, what's their type of fat, are they eating less seed oils and more animal fat, whatever it may be.
Do you
So
recommend this quinoa, like to lower your insulin? I mean,
with quinoa, you say?
yeah, so quinoa and rice. Do
Yeah,
you
yeah,
recommend
yeah.
it?
So within the spectrum of grains, I have a very sort of healthy fear of rice, or respect, because of what it can do to insulin. Although there are so many different types. For all I know, there are some types of rice that don't have such a substantial effect on glucose. But quinoa is one of them. Is one of the grains that has a much lower glucose effect or glycemic load. And so I would personally, I put that on the spectrum of the good end. And so one of the cereals that I make, we don't buy cereal in my home. That's absolute, that's candy. I mean, you may as well be giving the kid an ice cream treat almost for breakfast if you're giving them cereal. So, but we have our version of it, which started out years ago as just, we would make rice, and they would get rice milk with some cinnamon on it, and they just loved it. It's become their like favorite little treat for breakfast, that one day a week, because I make breakfast. I'm in charge of breakfast, and that's sort of the treat day, where it's rice milk and cinnamon. But slowly, when I make the rice in the rice pot, I'm putting in less rice and more of other grains, like quinoa, and I also put in shredded coconut, because I just want to get more of that, of a good fat in there. And so the shredded coconut gets very soft as it's in the rice cooker, and it just adds a subtle flavor to it, well, to the rice or whatever the grains I'm cooking. So slowly, I'm cutting back on the rice, and I'm increasing something like quinoa. Sometimes I use buckwheat and other grains that you can get. But just I'm cutting back on the rice and using some other grains in the place, like
And
quinoa.
so, yeah, so the other question I have is, what about these protein shakes and excess protein?
Oh, yeah.
Everything we're looking at in this world is drink this protein shake, drink that protein shake, and so does
Yeah.
that feel like that could also cause some issues with your insulin?
Oh, totally. Yeah. So when it comes to protein shakes, in fact, I'm really glad you brought that up. Um, Protein shakes are usually going to be garbage. And that's mostly because of what else they're putting in. It's not the protein per se that's a problem. If they're getting a whey protein, I am an advocate personally of whey. If someone isn't getting enough protein in their diet because they're not eating enough meat or dairy, um, and which is so much more of a viable protein source than pretty much anything else. But if they aren't getting enough, then whey is a nice, easy way to do it. But as you buy like a bag or a little tub of a protein drink, it's going to have crystallized fructose in it, or it's going to have sugar, or in any of its clever little names, because sugar has there's so many different words for sugar nowadays, but it's all the same thing. But it'll have other molecules, some colors, some dyes, and all kinds of stuff. I don't want any of that. And so I just, if I feel like I need enough protein or I didn't get enough and I need a little more, I just have pure unflavored whey. And that has a much smaller insulin effect than these more processed versions. Even if it still has whey, it's going to have other things in it that I just don't want. So protein drinks, and nowadays I see so many people with those little kind of boxes of protein drink that you can buy like in a big flat of them. They're just peeling off the lid and drinking that down. And those are loaded with vegetable or seed oils. And that's like just what we talked about earlier. Those are the oils that, as a scientist, for me, when I look at what is happening to that fat in the body, well, boy, that oil is getting oxidized the moment it's pretty much touching the atmosphere. And so it's very unstable fats, which makes them pretty unhealthy. So I don't drink those kinds of things.
Now, when you're talking about whey, and are there gluten-free versions? I feel like that's
Now, whey doesn't have any gluten in it. The
okay.
question would be, does whey have casein in it? And
Okay.
I don't think it does. I'm embarrassed that I don't know that. I think that that is without the casein, but I'm not certain. I don't know. You'd have
I
to
know
look.
my brain is we've always stayed away from it, but I know there's other ways of doing protein shakes that are like super, you can figure it out for our kiddos that are gluten free, dairy free, and not all
Oh,
that
easily.
garbage.
Yeah. Now, just
You know,
someone would just need to know that when they're trying to all these, um, if it's animal, if it's plant derived, we just don't absorb as much of it. That's just the only thing someone would need to consider. That it's harder for us to get all that protein from plants, and we do just get animal. We just absorb animal protein more readily. That's very actively studied. There are very good scientists that look at that and have answered that question very thoroughly.
now what about, let's talk about sugar now. So, obviously, one of the things I love is Lakanto because, and I love to talk a little bit about Lakanto because I know when I first found that company, I was just shocked because, if it's somebody that has diabetes, I don't have diabetes, but, if somebody has diabetes, they can have that.
Yep.
It doesn't feed yeast, and that's one of our biggest concerns, at least for me in
Mm-hmm.
autism, is sugars feed yeast. Sugars just bad stuff to your body, and so I want to talk about, first of all, let's talk about Lakanto and why that's such a great alternative. Prior to knowing about Lakanto, I only knew about stevia. It's
Yeah.
something I would give, and I feel very confident to give stevia. Feel confident to give Lakanto to my son. Although it seems as though Lakanto for me is easier to bake with. It really feels as though it's just a little bit goes a long ways. And to me, I don't see the difference from. And I grew up traditional, having sugar and everything else. If I
Yeah.
were to make a cookie with Lakanto versus a cookie with sugar, I actually think the cookie with Lakanto tastes better. So it could just be I've been in this community for 14 years, and this is the way my lifestyle is now. But that's I was really excited because years ago when my son first got diagnosed, there was nothing like Lakanto out
Oh,
there that
yeah.
I knew
Right.
about. And today, honestly, there's just so many amazing alternatives. So first of all, let's talk about what Lakanto is. I know it's from the monk fruit, but let's talk about that and why why this is such a great alternative and why it does what it does with somebody that has diabetes can be able to eat it. Somebody that is worried about yeast can have it. So I'll give it to you.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are, as you mentioned, there has been such a birth of these non-caloric sweeteners as alternatives for sugar, and there is a spectrum within them, which is sometimes hard to really tease out because it can also, a lot of the studies that have been published, they look at, well, what's the effect of this sweetener on glucose and insulin if it is consumed with a carbohydrate-rich meal, and that's not how I'm consuming this sweetener. So, nevertheless, Lakanto with the monk fruit extract, and I'm not an expert on this. I don't know what exactly how they're getting it, but you would know more about that than me. All I know is that their sweeteners are a mix of the monk fruit extract and erythritol. And erythritol and monk fruit extract are both very good, no effect on insulin, which is, so they along with other sweeteners go into my very, and stevia too. I just don't like the taste of stevia. There's a very strong aftertaste that I just am, I feel it. I really taste it. It doesn't make me sick. I just don't like it very much. But stevia is a good one that doesn't increase glucose and insulin. But that for me is the cutoff. There are other sweeteners that do. Like if someone, as a person who studies, ketosis and ketones for me, and the reason I care about them is that as insulin goes down, ketones start to climb as the liver starts using fat for fuel and creating ketones. And I promise this has a point. But we know that some sweeteners, someone will take the sweeteners and will notice ketones drop quite quickly. That means insulin's going up. That's what we're measuring indirectly. And so that's sort of a gauge for me to know, is this a sweetener I want to take or not? And the monk fruit extract, stevia, erythritol, to be honest, even aspartame alone doesn't increase insulin and glucose. And so as unpopular as that may be because the fear of cancer or whatever, which I think is overhyped, but nevertheless, sugar has a substantial effect on insulin, a substantial effect on blood glucose, and on just the health of the liver because of the fructose that sugar also turns into. And the liver has to handle all that fructose almost on its own, just like it has to handle alcohol on its own. It's the only tissue to handle those molecules. But the real problem with sugar is just how pervasive it is, where it has become part of every packaged food, almost. I think the official number is 73% of all packaged foods have some form of sugar, of an added sugar. And so someone could be looking back, like I have family members that give their kids these supposedly healthy little granola bars, and they say, well, it doesn't have sugar, and you turn it over, and the second ingredient after the wheat or oats is what do they call it? Brown rice syrup. That's sugar. It's just different ways that marketing people are calling it to try to mask it, but it's in virtually every sauce. I mean, try to find a ketchup that doesn't have sugar in it. You can, but it's not easy. You're going to look through the whole stinking aisle before you find the sugar-free ketchup. Try to find a peanut butter without sugar. I don't want sugar in my ketchup and my peanut butter. I'm not buying those things because they're sweet, and yet it is there. Try to find a loaf of bread without sugar in it. I mean, it's if you're going to eat the bread, but it's almost impossible. And I don't want my bread to taste sweet. That's not why I'm buying it. And so, one of the things that I'm so passionate about is, one, not only eating less sugar, and for me that means usually I give myself one treat a week. Not that I'm trying to make this very specific, but I would want someone to kind of leave with a takeaway message in a way. So it's one, restrict sugar, and set some boundaries for it. And then two, know the enemy. In other words, acknowledge that sugar is going to probably be in foods that you don't expect. And so while you're trying to reduce your sugar, but you're eating a peanut butter sandwich, you're getting sugar from both the bread and the peanut butter, and certainly the jelly. If you're putting that on, heavens, that'll be very high source of sugar. So someone needs to recognize it in all of its many places. And then so for me, it's give myself sugar once a week, and it's because I'm going with the family to get some ice cream, and I know the sugar's going to have ice cream, and that's my treat, or whatever it is. Just recognize it in all of its many forms and acknowledge that sugar nowadays is going to be in pretty much every packaged food. You just won't necessarily taste it, or you might not even see the word sugar on the ingredient label.
When I think that today people automatically think, oh, well, if I don't have diabetes, right, then I don't really have to worry about my sugar. I don't have to worry about my insulin. I don't have to worry about X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Autism, I mean, at least in my world, I really worry about sugar. I really get nervous about sugar often because I think of yeast and everything else. And just recently have I really been looking at insulin because my son doesn't have diabetes, but I also know that there's something to do with this sugar regulation in his body. Yep. You can definitely tell when he has a crash of not feeling good and headaches. I joke because a lot of men, when they get hungry, they'll say that they're hangry, right?
Yeah.
And really, would that not be a reduction or increase or whatever? I don't know which side of the fence it would be on, but wouldn't that be the fact that their blood sugar has probably dropped and they?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, what's so relevant about? I love that you're bringing that up. That doesn't necessarily mean what people want to say is, oh, I'm getting hangry or whatever. I'm irritable. I'm hungry. I'm agitated, and it's because I'm hypoglycemic. My blood sugar's too low. That is an extremely uncommon event. Genuine hypoglycemia. That's a dangerously low level of glucose that most people will never ever get to. But what has happened perhaps is that their brain is so wired to only use glucose that as they eat a starchy food, they have that nice big bump in glucose levels, and then they have a rebound event where they come down a little lower than where they normally are. Not that they're hypoglycemic, but they relatively are based on where they usually happen to be. And they feel that deficiency. And so what they do when they come below is that almost that letdown, they need to snack on something. They feel that compulsion to snack on something. And yet all they are doing is just taking the roller coaster back up, and it's going to come back down. And so one of the benefits of someone beginning to make a dietary shift to control these refined sources of carbohydrates is you begin to take this roller coaster and turn it into something like this, where there's just a more steady flux or steady changes in glucose. And moreover, as ketones start to climb, with insulin being more in control, then ketones are also very readily used by the brain and represent a very beneficial and viable source of fuel for the brain. And that's something most people, even scientists, don't really appreciate, trained medical professionals. The dogma is, the brain uses 100% glucose, and that is categorically false. There's no question that is not true. When ketones go up in the blood, the brain uses the ketones very readily, and there's evidence to suggest, like the study with the 6-year-old autistic boy, and people with dementia and Parkinson's. There's studies to suggest that maybe, in fact, the brain benefits from it.
What's something somebody in the community or leaders can do to kind of just help, I think, really spread this message, but to really help lower this whole insulin revolution, almost, it feels like, this increase that we have? Like, how do we, in the community, I mean, I know for me, it's like, okay, well, yes, we have products like Lecanto, regardless of something like stevia or not. We have these things where, honestly, before we didn't even have those options. And the artificial sweeteners that we have that are, I hate to name brand them, but we all know what they are. In most, diet beverages of some sort. We know those are good for us. We know that those, definitely, people will say, oh, this causes this or this causes that. Obviously, the studies that have been done, at least that I've seen, have been like bathtubs full of it. But regardless, if you know it's a little bit of poison, why do you want a little bit of poison?
Yeah, we could say the same. Well, the tragedy is we could say the same thing about sugar.
Right.
And we know that sugar is causing problems. And so, and yet it gets a free pass. We're not, I mean, people are afraid of aspartame, and yet why aren't they afraid of sugar, where there are more studies published looking at the downside of sugar than there are and I'm not defending any sweetener, not at all. It's not my intention, but my intention is, it's surprising that sugar gets sort of a free pass. And so for me, what could someone do? It would truly be scrutinize your diet and what you're eating in your home and your family, and ask yourselves, how much sugar are we getting? And not that someone has to count the grams or something. What a tedious way to live. But just make some family rules, make it part of a family discussion. And that's not easy. I mean, I'm a father of young kids. I know they want sugar, and they're going to find a way to get it nowadays. And if they're not going to get it in our house, they're going to get it in someone else's. And so I just try to leave my kids with a good respect of insulin, of sugar, and why we eat it when we eat it, and try to make it be something that happens as sort of an event, or just not as common, and have alternatives around.
Absolutely. And I think that today we are living in such a better, as much as I don't like hearing the insulin rates are up and diabetes and things like that, we're living in a better world of options. And I think that,
no question. Yep. As problems, we've made problems, but we've also made solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what can we tell families out there? Like, again, like I want to leave them with like some action steps, right? So when you're in a grocery store, you mentioned that they can, look for raspberries and strawberries and blueberries, and those are great. Like on your tiers, as you mentioned. And then you said this next, but I'm just going to stick with like the better of the tiers. Talk about the vegetables being really the ones in your mind that grow below the ground. So let's just maybe name a few of those. Which ones would you pick? What are your top ones?
Yeah. So to clarify, the vegetables that grow in ground are the ones to be more wary of.
Oh, wary of. I'm glad I clarified.
So the vegetables that grow above ground, so pretty much any leafy greens, no problem. And then even other things that are also growing above ground, like tomatoes, peppers, you name it, pretty much, and they're going to be all right.
So any root vegetable is really where you kind of want to stay away from, it sounds like.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. And then your fats and proteins, we talked about that. Obviously, I gave my opinion, and I really do believe we need to have, if we're going to buy animal protein, which obviously we do in our home, I want to make sure it's organic. I want to make sure there's no hormones in there. I think that's super important, because today I feel like the meats are just, there's no, I'm always mind blown when someone's like, oh, it's filled with hormones. You're like, well, why are you buying that? I know sometimes we have no options, maybe because we're out and about or whatever else as adults, but as for our kiddos, I think it's different. And then we have eggs. We talked about that as well. We talked about the alternatives of, when you're looking at dairy, or you can use things that are like young coconut kefir and that such. Is there anything? Oh, and then you talked about also, without really emphasizing this, about red meat being a higher a good protein, but obviously the whites like turkey and chicken are still
Those are fine.
definitely acceptable. Is there anything that I'm missing when I'm just thinking, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go grocery shop
Yeah.
with Dr. Benjamin, you know, like what are we going to pick out? You know, I love also the thing you said, and I want to make sure I get that quote that what you said about you, in your family, you try to stay away from boxes and
boxes and bags with barcodes. Yeah.
boxes, bags, and barcodes.
Yeah, foods that come out of boxes and bags with barcodes. Yeah, so a little bit of alliteration to help the medicine go down.
Yeah, I really, really love that. So I think, and then also, you know, for the Lecanto guys they're one of our partners here on the summit. We want to make sure you guys understand that we love them. They're one of our partners with the Autism Hope Alliance. I think I've mentioned it more than once. One of the reasons I love it is because it doesn't feed yeast. And I think that's super important. Yeast is the beast for our kiddos. And we don't want to feed something, but we also don't want to take away our childhood memories, right? Like our childhood memories where you could have a cookie that was a special treat. But I love what you said about your breakfast and how once a week you do kind of a special thing. I think that we really need to get back to that philosophy of how we feed our families, not just our children, but ourselves. I grew up in a time where a cookie was considered a serious treat. Like if I got a cookie, it might have been once a week if I was lucky, right? It seemed to me, I have memories of Fridays or Saturday nights having that one special treat for whatever reason that seems to be. Now in school lunches, it's like, oh, okay, here's their cookie, here's this, here's that. When did we ever become a society that you got a cookie every day? Yeah. So I think that's just something to think about. But at the same time, Lecanto, I never feel bad at all giving my son anything that has Lecanto, the alternative, the monk fruit sugar, because I know it's not doing anything bad in his body. And yet it's almost like tricking him, believing it's like this amazing it is an amazing treat, but it tricks him into believe it's one of those other treats, right?
Yeah.
So I love that. Now, do you have any messages that you want to leave our families with? I know a lot of them are probably going, gosh, this was so much great information, because often in the autism community, we don't talk about things like insulin. Yet I definitely think it's that hangry version of our kids, especially if you have kids that are growing, which all of our kids are. They're always hangry in my mind. And, you know, do you recommend maybe, this is something I think we need to get better at even, where you maybe offer snacks every, 2.5 hours or something. Like, how do you recommend that? Like for us, I feel like we're so traditional: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a snack at some point.
Well, yeah. So for me, snacks are dangerous in a way, and I try to discourage them in my home, frankly. Okay. And I've tried to do that from the very beginning, though. So it's kind of more of the culture of the family, mind you. So you don't have to try to fight too much of a habit already. But nevertheless, snacks tend to be a food that's not going to be as good. And I don't mind that they have that 4-hour period just to give them time to let their insulin come down. I mean, I hate to kind of sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but I want insulin to be in control. And if you're snacking every 2 hours, not that someone's doing that, but then pretty much what you're doing is every time insulin's about to come down, you're just bumping it back up. And I don't want that. I want insulin to have a period of time when it comes down. And so I don't love snacks, but sometimes the kid just has to eat something. And I'd say then have options like berries. In my home, it's berries. We get little kind of jerky beef sticks they can eat, or cheese sticks, because I'm okay. We're okay with dairy. But nevertheless, have some options that I can be comfortable with in my home that isn't going to increase insulin. But if there's a takeaway message, and to try to make it relevant to why anyone would be listening to this, which would be that they have a loved one with autism and they want to have some strategy, I would say appreciate the fact that the brain is very much subject to the peaks and troughs of insulin, of glucose, as glucose is coming up and down so dramatically with certain foods. And then realize that even beyond the brain, what insulin can be doing to the rest of the body, and that by controlling these refined sugars and starches, they can help the child and themselves get off of that roller coaster of blood glucose levels and perhaps the changes that the brain experiences as it's so violently, getting flooded with glucose and then being a little deprived of glucose. There are changes to make, and that really begins with controlling and scrutinizing carbohydrate consumption.
Absolutely. I think that's a great takeaway message. And I've just so enjoyed talking with you. I want to let the listeners or the people watching know that Lakanto, like I said, is one of our partners. And they're giving away 100 bags of stuff. So you definitely want to make sure to be part of those raffles because it's just so cool. And you will never, ever taste anything like this. I assure you. And everything we talked about, you don't have to worry about any of that. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it's true.
You guys love the summit and you loved what we were talking about and you love all the other speakers. Definitely, this is something you guys can go to autismhopesummit.com. You can buy. You can have Benjamin in your living room every day and rewatch that over and over again. So my takeaway message for you guys is, just don't give up hope. We have people like Benjamin who may not be part of our community, but wants to help our community, which I just love. I love the fact that you're not in the autism community, but you want to help our community. And this is I feel like I took so many takeaway homes. I love going to the grocery store with you today and figuring out what's going to work and what's not. So everyone, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you, Doctor, for being here today. And until next time, bye guys.
Thank you.